Would one of you like to reply or comment on this, or we can go to the next other questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead.
As European students and as European researchers, I believe that our first responsibility is to insist on the fact that the best opportunities are given for our Palestinian colleagues to express their ideas the more freely and to express them publicly and say what they have to say about their own society. I don't believe it is my place as the representative of the former colonizing state of Lebanon to say to anyone in the Middle East what they should do and what they should say about their own society.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Maybe we can take one more question. Yes, okay.
I have a question regarding collecting data in a situation like the Syria crisis, where there were, in particular, I'm asking about the Palestinian refugees from Syria, in a smaller context, in a larger context, the Syrians from Syria. There was a lot of money, as far as I know, that was put towards creating databases of information about the refugees. I would like your opinion about how, as far as you know, how useful that was, how negative that was, and how positive, if there is any positive in that arena. Because my concern is, although it would seem like a most logical thing to collect data and collect it in a database that is easily accessible for NGOs, for donors, etc., there was a lot of reticence about sharing information both from NGOs and from individuals for many reasons that are beyond the immediately obvious, such as political issues, etc., etc. So I would like your input, both your inputs on this issue, if possible.
Well, I'm very skeptical and I think very critical of these. On one hand, it's clear you can't manage an emergency situation without collecting data, because you need to know what you're actually dealing with, quantity, sizes, needs, etc. At the same time, as you also pointed out, that data is collected with certain strategic imperatives. They bring their own categories to bear on the situations they are trying to map. So they already start from a very fragmented and highly selective starting point of what they actually want to see, which from the very start removes any other interests from the actual data image that is generated in the context. And on top of that, the fact that most of the time, those whose information is collected never have any say and control over how this information is used and what kind of information should be collected in the first place, makes it a very critical, I call it, it simply reinforces mechanisms of dispossession that we have seen over and over again, where people lose gradually control over their lives. Because once you're stuck in such a database, like I said, your life becomes scalable in all sorts of directions and ways according to strategic agendas set elsewhere and outside the immediate context of your needs. And so I think in the future it should be actually mandatory. I'm actually arguing for a new code of obligation of NGOs and welfare organizations and anyone involved in such emergency operations. To really define a clear-cut, transparent and knowledge politics that grants those populations to whom they cater effective control over the not only what kind of knowledge is generated about them, but how it is used, and that it also involves an effective training, skills training for these populations themselves to work with this data themselves, because you certainly you depend on resources that UNHCR and whoever gives you. At the same time, it's clear they never fully meet your needs. But why should you be left out of actually making productive use of this knowledge and kind of start using it to make things better in your immediate context? So I think there's a lot to be done here still. Yeah.
particularly with local NGOs that have problems in sharing information with UNRWA or UNHCR.
Well, what kind of problems do you need? Because my experience in Al-Baghdad was actually devastating. You had these cluster meetings, blown up huge administrative apparatuses, and yet there's the fact that NGOs compete for donor money is prevents an open and transparent knowledge sharing. Files are transferred even at night times from one hotel room to the next to kind of check, is he claiming a furniture check he has already received from another NGO? You know, it's really down to this level. And it sounds very, and I think this needs to be stopped.
Yeah, I'm interested to understand the mechanism of stopping it, because it is very complicated.
Yeah, it's and it's highly problematic, because what you see right now is this open data, right? It has become the new buzzword for kind of accountability and transparency in the world of NGOs and international organizations. Yet what is labeled as open data has nothing to do with open and unlimited access to data generated by the World Bank all the way to UNRWA, and UNRWA is actually not participating in the first place. But it's, first of all, it's aggregate data. It's already what they have compiled as a statistical output of their data resources. And then again, according to criteria they themselves set, right? So it's not, no one is accountable to anyone. And what you end up facing is that local populations are again conscripted into using this information to see, has the money the World Bank has spent somewhere really gone to this particular village or not. So you are conscripted again in another mechanism of policing, rather than having information available to foster your own interest in your own community. So I think it cannot be on the level of voluntary commitments where it is now. It needs to be built into the legal mandate and legal obligations of international organizations. They are not private entities. They are financed with public money. And this means, the US sets a good model here, knowledge generated with public money is in the public domain. It cannot be held in closed closets.
I'm hogging this conversation, but if I may, because I found this very interesting. I'm really more concerned with the data that is the domain of the local NGOs that they refuse to share with the international NGOs. So it's not a matter of the INGOs collecting data.
Okay,
it's more
the locals.
a case of the local NGOs sharing data among themselves and with INGOs and other UN.
And what prevents them from sharing? Competition for donor money?
The competition you talked about is one aspect. Also, the other aspect, which I find is very interesting, is the fear that this data is going to be used against the very refugees that are supposed to be helping. And that's a very valid concern. And so this should be factored into any kind of mechanism or system that tries to legalize or put a framework.
And at the same time, they're easily used as an excuse for each other. You know, people in a patronizing manner sitting up on vital knowledge, claiming to protect the interests of the refugees, when in fact just claiming proprietary claims that are completely inappropriate. I find balance. Huge problem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both, Alex and Monica. And we have a half-hour break right now. Thank you all.
I just asked to introduce Rosemary's bio, but it's a very hard task too. So I think, like everybody knows here who Rosemary is, I don't want to introduce her formal position, because I think for most of us she is that committed scholar, and I think anyone who wants to study or talk about Palestinian refugees or issues around committed scholarship has to refer to Rosemary's work. I think I don't know what else to say. It's really hard to introduce a friend and and an idol scholar. We all we all want to be like her, but it is really hard to. What?
You can all go better.
No, we can't compete. So, I think Rosemary is going to talk about the economic entanglements of Palestinian refugee camps. So, I think it's a reflection back on how we need to fill a gap in the research of refugees in Lebanon. Sorry.
Thanks to Maysoon, and thanks to the Institute for inviting me to speak. I begin from the position that it is ethically and politically necessary that Palestinian refugee camps should remain in place until a just settlement has been achieved. And in an extension of this position, I hold that national institutions have an ethical and political obligation to advocate on behalf of camp populations, for example, by disseminating information about the Nakba, the hardships camp people suffer, and the resistances they put up. I also hold that national institutions are ethically and politically obliged to do whatever can be done to normalize life in camps, normalize in inverted commas, for example, through enriching cultural resources, establishing libraries, or through engaged research. This position is implicitly critical of the national leadership, both in its PLO and national authority forms, since these bodies have always kept a certain distance between themselves and the camps. This has been done in the case of the political leadership through emphasizing the international community's primary responsibility for the upkeep and servicing of the camps, and by the national cultural institutions through catering mainly to a foreign public in their research and publishing. This distancing was the case even between 1970 and 1980, when the PLO exercised direct control over most of the camps in Lebanon, policing them, recruiting members into the resistance organizations, forming local popular committees that represented and still represent the parties formed at that time, and offering many kinds of social service and financial inflow, salaries, compensation for damage, indemnities for the families of men killed in action, scholarships, and so on. Within the PLO's organigram, the camps came under the control of popular organizations, and from there under the executive committee. In popular memory, these bodies did less than they might have done to change material or cultural conditions in the camps. During the years 1973 to 1975, I was doing fieldwork in Burj al-Barajni camp and was exposed to views of the resistance movement that were mainly ones of praise, loyalty, and identification, but that included criticism of shortcomings. There were indemnities for war damage, and people were free to upgrade their homes, but there was very little improvement of public facilities such as waste disposal, water distribution, or air raid shelter building. NGOs linked to resistance factions extended services in the fields of health, education, and culture, but competition, overlap, and inadequate training weakened the impact of these efforts. Since Oslo, the national authorities further reduced concern for camps outside the West Bank. This is manifested politically in the authorities' surrender of the right to return, documented in the WikiLeaks papers. This connection is manifested concretely in the cutting off of or reduction of financial support to camp populations outside the West Bank. Some payments, scholarships, indemnities for widows, home repair, did continue to be considered rights and were administered by the PLO until the opening of the authority embassy in Beirut in 2011. At that point, the PLO was phased out and rights were rephrased as needs. For example, the PLO program to support Palestinian students was replaced by the Mahmoud Abbas Fund and regarded as charity, effectively depoliticizing it. Critics of the national leadership say that all PLO support passes through a better filter, including indemnities from martyrs' families, and that these payments augment the rank of feta martyrs in comparison with others. I note here that a women's campaign was successfully raised against this practice, an action that exemplifies women's economic and political agency. And I didn't have the time, unfortunately, to go and listen to the people who conducted this campaign, but before I publish this paper, I want to do that and add that story. Red Crescent hospitals still exist in some camps and are important because, one, UNRWA doesn't run hospitals, two, Palestinian refugees are excluded from social security, and three, because Lebanon's private medical system is extremely costly. But RC hospitals are said to be barely operational, and they depend on gifts for equipment, like, for instance, kidney dialysis. The salaries of Red Crescent doctors and nurses are indeed paid by the PLO-PNA, with the positive effect of lowering the costs of medical care for people in camps, but most other forms of PLO support, for example, scholarships, subventions to popular committees and NGOs, home repair indemnities, have been reduced or terminated. Though this disconnection has been implemented gradually so as not to totally destroy the leadership's influence outside the West Bank. The phasing out of financial support for camp populations outside occupied Palestine falls within the policy of de-development analysed by Sarah Roy in relation to Gaza and applicable to the Palestinian people at large. Camps are the targets of occasional distributions by Islamic political parties and charities, and, as I noted earlier, by the PLO-PNA. But this latter role is one that earns it neither loyalty nor respect. Diana Allen quotes a one-time PLO fighter, Abu Yusuf, who, in order to receive a monthly stipend of $26, would have to attend monthly feta meetings in Ein Helud camp. He expresses his disgust in words that point to a historically formed Palestinian life skill. Quote, "We have become experts in survival. We can buy aid clothes for 3 children with $50, or cook a meal on a gas stove with a single flame." These words suggest how closely Palestinian resistance to political erasure is welded to and embodied in economic self-denial. One of the curious facts about camp economies is the degree of stratification found in them, in the wide gap separating poorest from better-off households. FAFO's Economic and Social Survey carried out in 1999 found that, quote, "the poorest decile accounts for only 1% of all incomes, whereas the upper decile earns 32% of all incomes, while the upper two deciles together account for half of all incomes earned. This income gap is gendered in the sense that, quote, while a total of 18% of households in camps and gatherings have a female head, they account for 43% and 26% in the lowest and next lowest income categories, respectively. Given that all Palestinians with refugee ID cards face the same labour market conditions and the same obstacles to migration, the size of this gap calls for explanation. But because surveys are synchronic, they cannot tell us about causes and processes. A diachronic investigation, i.e. one over time, goes back into the history of households, poor households, would be useful in guiding interventions aimed at equalization. Histories of the poorest families, probably for the most part female-headed, would be valuable in pinpointing obstacles to women exercising economic agency in any form. The proportion of female-headed households among the poorest two deciles is higher at, sorry, it's a repetition here that I haven't ironed out. I note here that the existence in camps of exceptional poverty supports their representation in hostile Lebanese media as nests of delinquency and potential criminality, a reputation that puts pressure on the better off to separate themselves by moving out. Given the November 2012 admission of the National Authority to the UN General Assembly as a non-member observer state, it is an open question how long the international community will continue to fill the responsibility towards the Palestinians that it undertook in 1947 with the UN Partition Conference and in 1948 with the creation of the refugee problem. In a context of the national leadership's weakening resistance to US and Israeli political and economic pressures, the camps and their inhabitants form a kind of last-ditch obstacle to erasing the Nakba. Yet it is an obstacle that the international community, mobilized by its most powerful members, might find a way to dissolve in the framework of national authority territorialization, i.e. you've got your state in West Bank, that's it, everything else is off the agenda. As global political and economic frameworks shift, so does the balance of arguments in the international arena for and against maintaining refugee camps. Indeed, as ethnographer Petit points out, the transformation of the Palestinian camps into foci of political mobilization has sharpened international deciders against this form of dealing with refugees. In the discussions of the camps, most interested parties, whether they're host government officials, diplomats, Palestinian or other scholars, tend to assume that UNRWA will always be there to provide the main economic basis on which the reproduction of camps depends. Yet is this assumption justified? UNRWA has always suffered budgetary crisis, but in 2015 this reached a peak as the agency faced a deficit of more than 100 million, the largest in its history. Since early 2015, evidence is accumulating that UNRWA is facing increasing difficulty in meeting its existing commitments, let alone implementing the improvements it has promised in the fields of education and health. In August 2015, UNRWA's Commissioner General voiced fears that schools would not be able to open, causing panic waves across the region. The deficit showed up rapidly in Lebanon in relation to medical expenditures, setting off a wave of demonstrations. In January 2016, a Palestinian patient unable to obtain treatment for thalassemia set himself on fire. The Council of Palestinian Human Rights Organization presented UNRWA's funding crisis as, quote, a dangerous policy precedent insofar as UNRWA is able gradually to divest itself of its responsibility towards those to whom it is mandated to provide services. In Lebanon, a recent AUB UNRWA study of economic and social conditions in the camps states unequivocally that if, quote, UNRWA was not present in Lebanon, overall poverty among refugees would increase by 14%, and extreme poverty would be multiplied by 3. And this is a very dire estimate, given that Palestinian refugees in Lebanon already show the highest proportion of hardship of all UNRWA fields, while 9 out of 10 households are estimated to live below the poverty level. A lowering of camp household income in Lebanon cannot be compensated for by increased employment because Lebanese legal constraints close all but unskilled levels of the labour market to Palestinians. Nor can it be raised through migration, since there are few countries that grant entry to Palestinian refugees from Lebanon. Even when they manage to leave, usually clandestinely, employment in countries of second refuge is not guaranteed, and many migrants spend long periods in internment camps. Further, a general lowering of household income would deplete resources for the financing of self-employment and domestic production. Diminution of UNRWA's budget would undoubtedly affect the 2 items among its social services that are most important to refugees, i.e. health and education. When trying to assess the stability, the permanence of the camps, UNRWA and PLO are not the only economic factors to take into consideration. We need also to embrace the effects on them of capitalism. The camps exist in a region where weak states have yielded to global forces that promote de-development and high rates of unemployment. Yet, simultaneously, capitalism promotes middle-class life ambitions and is thus liable to fragment marginal, economically disenfranchised communities. Though community fragmentation has been more studied in Latin America than in the Arab East, there is, in fact, an exceptional study on the Mashriq region that gives us leads in thinking about capitalism in Palestinian camps. This is Idris Khalid's Economic Determinants of Social Change in the Peasant Communities, an AUB MA thesis dated 1975. Khalidi examines the impact of capitalism on social structure in rural communities in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria and Iraq, using an exceptional number of village studies carried out in the early and mid-20th century. Though he uses the term market economy rather than capitalism, his method of collating studies of economic change with studies of social change at the village level offers a clear view of capitalist impact. On the economic side of the equation, he lists 1. The penetration of European capital, production for the market instead of for subsistence, the formation of large estates, the linking of villages to cities, monetization, destruction of local industry and crafts, the rise of a rural middle class, occupational differentiation, and the phasing out of communal land tenure, or mesha. Predominant as the land tenure system in the whole of the region except Lebanon until well into the 20th century, mesha tenure tends to produce equality, cooperation in agricultural production, and settlement of conflict within the community. The eradication of mesha, to quote Khalidi, ultimately led to the wholesale dispossession of most of the peasantry. The studies of social change in rural communities shows the correlates of the market economy, i.e. growing inequality of income, decline in agricultural cooperation, changes in habitat, lifestyle, consumption, decline in clan endogamous marriages, and an increased resort to courts to settle conflicts. The wealthiest families show a tendency to separate from their kin-based haras and to create new residential quarters. The wealthier families also tend to intermarry, overriding customs of clan endogamy. The senior men frequently connect to the state, furthering economic and class differentiation. These trends appear to hold true across Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. And while 5 years separate the villages of Khalid's study from the refugee camps today, yet his correlations between the economic and the social are still suggestive. The question I raise here is, how do camp communities hold together, if indeed they do, in the face of the market's powerful fragmenting forces? What factors that surveys do not account for enable camps to reproduce themselves over time as communities that stamp identities in politics? What values and practices of communality survive in them from earlier periods? We know some of the means that have enabled camp communities in the past to withstand capitalist fragmentation. Besides UNRWA's basic inputs, people work from the beginning. There were and are family and village funds, local markets, manufacture and trade, migration networks, diaspora transfers, and zakat, charity. In all of these, the national, social, cultural, and economic are, it seems to me, inseparable. Thus, research focused on these practices, and especially on people's perceptions of their relevance, would offer a more realistic picture on which to base support interventions, money support or economic support interventions, that is available today. An economic ethnography of a Palestinian camp would examine all kinds of value that exist beyond salaries and wages. I'm speaking here of domestic production and home-based trade, savings associations and credit schemes, loans, services exchanged rather than paid for, and what we may term indigenous charity. All of these are based on personal relations fostered through camp proximity and the sharing of its hardships, exclusions, atmosphere, and intimacy. In her ethnography of Shatila camp, Diana Allen depicts a small shop credit system set up by Fatima, a woman without local family connections. Daily life familiarity with customers is essential to Fatima in decisions regarding advancing credit. You have to have an idea of what people earn and what they spend before you decide how much credit to give, she says. Camp proximity facilitates such knowledge, and thus the circulation of loans of money, goods, equipment, gifts, and above all, information, so crucial in marginal communities. A question we might pose is how much do expectations and experiences of such exchanges contribute to decisions to stay in camp communities rather than to leave them? And when people rent a